I'm very happy to be welcoming people who are attending this webinar. If there's a little bit of a lag, it's because I just got off the plane from Japan yesterday, but I am really delighted to be introducing our October speaker, Professor Claudia Orenstein, who is Professor of Theater at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of CUNY. Claudia's done a tremendous amount of research, particularly on puppetry. Her scholarship travels have taken her to India, South Africa, France, Vietnam, Spain, and she spent 2021 to 2022 in Japan exploring traditional ritual puppetry on a Fulbright research fellowship. Claudia traveled all across Japan, researching traditions from Oita in the south to Aomori in the north, and we are really in for a treat to hear from her today. So, Claudia, the mic is being passed over to you. Thank you.
Great. So thank you so much, and I appreciate it feel very honored to have been asked to give this talk and to introduce you to the Bunraku Theater. So Bunraku is a unique and beautiful art, and it combines the efforts of numerous artists in bringing exquisitely crafted puppets to life to enact deeply emotional and dramatic tales. So in my talk tonight, what I plan to do is introduce you to a bit of the history and development of this form, and through that to the various artistic components that make up this art. So we'll look at a variety of different aspects of this tradition. So first, to start with some terminology. Bunraku can be understood as the marriage of three originally independent arts that first came together toward the end of the 16th century. So ningyō, or puppetry, the work of the gidayu, or tayu, who was a storyteller chanter, and the playing of the three-stringed shamisen. A full performance requires the coordination of all of these arts, and you can say that it includes even more. So puppetry, for instance, requires distinct arts of building figures as well as performing puppets. And even their upkeep requires skilled artisans. So for example, backstage at the Bunraku, there are people whose specialty is just fixing and dressing the puppet's hair. Chanting, of course, also relies on the important and distinct art of poetic, dramatic storytelling. So you need to investigate all of these to understand Bunraku. I'll start by clarifying a few terms. So Bunraku is also known as ningyō jōruri. The term ningyō means both doll and puppet, and jōruri means pure crystal. And it refers to a style of chanting that came to be used in the puppet theater around the 15th century. And it comes from Lady Jōruri, who was a character in a popular puppet play of the time, which was a love story between her and Yoshitsune, the celebrated warrior of the Minamoto clan. And it referred to the style of music that was used in that play. So ningyō jōruri means puppets combined with this form of music and chanting. Other forms have existed that combine puppetry with different styles of chanting, such as Sekkyo ningyō, which grew out of Buddhist sermons, and that form has a more sorrowful mood and stories that focus on individuals undergoing dreadful suffering, framed within Buddhist precepts. Now, the term Bunraku, which is the more common term that we use today, comes from Uemura Bunraku Ken, and he was a chanter from Awaji who came to Osaka in 1800 and brought new life to the puppet theater when its popularity had begun to wane. He first opened a jōruri school for amateurs, and he later formed his students into a company. In 1872, after he died, his descendants opened a theater, and they named it the Bunraku-za in his honor. So it's because of the popularity of that theater that the term Bunraku has now become synonymous with this form of performance in general. So puppets have a long history in Japan, and we might identify two main sources contributing to their development. One is indigenous ritual practices and also foreign entertainment forms. So ningyō, puppet or doll, that term literally means a human-shaped thing, and its kanji or characters can also be read as hitogata. And that's a term that generally refers to indigenous practices using human-shaped figures for purification or to ward off evil spirits, often as body substitutes. So for example, I have on this slide on one side, amagatsu, and these are cloth dolls that were given to pregnant women or babies, and they were meant to keep bad spirits and illness away from the unborn or newborn infant by attracting negative forces to themselves instead. On the other side of this slide, you can see that if you go to Jishu Shrine today, which is on the grounds of Kiyomizu-dera Temple in Kyoto, you're invited to write your troubles down on a human-shaped piece of paper and put it in the adjacent bucket of water. And your troubles should dissolve away with the paper. Within early Shinto, there were a series of dates throughout the year that were anchoring points for the changing seasons. These were times of transition that were thought to be dangerous and open to negative forces. And each was celebrated with some form of doll-related rite to clear out impurities and invite blessings. The most well-known and widely practiced, maybe one you've heard of, is the Girls' Day Festival, or Hinamatsuri, which happens every year on March 3rd. And families today set out dolls representing the Heian imperial court to celebrate young girls and ensure their health and good fortunes. The original practice involved setting straw dolls on paper boats and sending them down the river to take away illness and misfortune. And you can see that these festivals don't happen much, but there's one festival where now these Heian dolls are sent down the river in a boat. You can see that model here, and those are then burned. So anyway, active doll figures had a strong presence in early Japanese culture. Now, around the 8th century, we start to find references to puppets used for entertainment, and the term kugutsu comes into use. In the 11th century, Oe-no Masafusa, who was an advisor to the Emperor Go-Sanjo, in an essay that is about kugutsu, describes them as itinerant performers living in animal skin tents who are skilled in archery and horseback riding. They perform acts like juggling, magic tricks, and dancing. They sing seductive songs and play voluptuous music, and they do puppetry with wooden puppets made of beechwood. Now, these performers, some speculate, may have come to Japan from other parts of Asia, having traveled across the Silk Road. The term kugutsu eventually comes to mean puppeteer or be associated specifically with puppeteers. So entertainment and ritual puppetry mixed in various ways in Japan. And in the medieval period, we find records of kugutsu associated with the Sanjo or outcast districts that were near Nishinomiya Shrine in Hyogo Prefecture. And they were involved with shrine activities, and they used puppets of the lucky god Ebisu in their rites. Itinerant performers called hako mawashi, which means like box and going around because they carried their puppets in boxes and traveled. So this tradition developed out of this community at Nishinomiya. And there are these wonderful performers today who still practice this art in Tokushima. And I actually write a lot about them in other places. So I love to share their work. It was puppeteers from Awaji who went up to Osaka and established what became Bunraku there, not specifically from these forms, but from this world of puppetry that grew up in Tokushima. And I'm going to sneak this slide in. So there are a lot of other very wonderful puppet traditions in Japan associated with different kinds of rituals that I don't have time to talk about today, but I just wanted to show this slide and make you aware of some of these other wonderful styles of puppetry that are part of Japanese cultural heritage. So now Japan also has a long history of epic storytelling. beginning with itinerant bards who accompanied themselves on the biwa, or Japanese lute. And that was derived from the Chinese pipa, as they sang their heroic tales. In the 12th century, we see the emergence of what are called biwa hoshi. These are blind lute priests, and they were involved with plague prevention and spiritual purification. But what grew in popularity was their telling of stories from the Heike Monogatari, or the tale of the Heike. This epic recounts events of the Genpei War from 1180 to 1185 between the Taira and Minamoto clans. And these roots continue to reveal themselves in the many Bunraku plays that still showcase stories from this epic conflict. It's tales of battles, of honor lost and won, of sacrifices of noble warriors and political intrigues, of women and children enduring captivity. These all prove popular subjects for stage drama for the Bunraku, as well as also for the Puppeteer. So sometime in the 16th century, the artists, oh, sorry, I'm going to move back here. The artists Sawazumi Kenkyo and Takino Koto traded their biwas for a new instrument that had come in from China originally through the Ryukyu Islands and had started to become very popular, and that was the three-stringed shamisen. And it was their descendants, their disciples, who joined puppetry with music and chanting to create a new art form. They traded some of their epic tales for more popular fare, and the shamisen contributed to the lively new music and chanting style that became known as jōruri. So we see this new marriage now between puppetry and the storytelling traditions. So this ningyō jōruri underwent an important transformation in the late 17th century. When Takemoto Gidayu, who was a popular and gifted chanter, started his own theater, and in 1685 took on a new playwright to work with him, and that was Chikamatsu Monzaemon. And I'm going to talk more about him in a moment. But Gidayu's new style of chanting synthesized earlier models into what became known as Shin, or new jōruri. And his legacy is such that today his name, Gidayu or Tayu, is the term used for all the storytellers and chanters in the Bunraku theater. A very demanding art, the chanters do the voices of all the characters in the play, expressing their dialogue and emotions, and they recite the descriptive poetic narrations that set the scenes and fill out the full emotional dimensions of the dramatic moments, using language rich with imagery and allusions. They work closely with the shamisen players, whose poignant strains express the moods of the situations in their own way. Now, this combination of chanting and music is a highly prized art on its own. During World War II, for example, it was common for presentations of Bunraku storytelling to be on the radio without the need for puppets at all. The yukahon, which you see up here in the corner, is the book of the play's text, or the libretto, that the narrator uses for reciting. Chanters might inherit these from their teachers or copy out their own versions of them, which is also an aid for memorization. And they do them in calligraphy, as you see. And they put in notation marks as guides for performances. So the black writing that you see in the photo is the text itself of the play, and the red is the notations. And you see it's all just streamlined. There aren't like act breaks. It's all a single story. Now, I'm going to show you a few other little objects that are associated with the chanters here. One is the kendai, and that is the stand that they put the libretto on when they're performing. And there is a wonderful, if you're in New York, and you can see this wonderful exhibit that's up on Bunraku Theater at the Japan Society. They have wonderful information about a lot about this tradition, and I put here a few details that I actually learned at this exhibit that I hadn't known about the kendai. First of all, it's the personal possession of the narrator, and the lacquer motif that's on it harmonizes with the story. They also said that it is made without nails and dismantled between shows. And something that really surprised me is that these are very precious because there are no remaining craftspeople building these today. So that's something to think about. Now you see how they sit when they're performing. They're not actually sitting on their only on their heels. You'll see at the bottom here, there's a picture of a little stool that they're sitting on. And there is a beanbag weight that they put inside their kimono, and also a sash they attach around their stomachs. And these are both the weight also helps keep them balanced as they're performing, perched on this stool. But also both the weight and the sash are there to help support the diaphragm and their speaking as they perform. You're probably familiar with the shamisen. I only wanted to say one thing about it, which is that there are different kinds of shamisen, and the futozao, which is the largest and heaviest, or the thick-necked shamisen, is the one that's used in Bunraku because it has a very low sound. So now getting back to Chikamatsu Monzaemon, this playwright that Hidaya worked with, he is one of the most renowned literary figures in Japan. And he's often referred to as the Shakespeare of Japan, which is a way of trying to express the breadth and impact of his work. He wrote primarily for the puppet theater, but also for kabuki. And it was not uncommon for the Bunraku and kabuki to borrow or steal from each other's repertoires. And many of Chikamatsu's plays, originally written for puppets, have also become kabuki classics. He penned important what are called jidaimono, or history plays. For example, Goban Taiheki, which is translated as a chronicle of great peace played on a chessboard. And it's an early play on the theme of the 47 Ronin that was staged just a few years after those events took place, the historical events. Koksen Yakasen is another example, Battles of Koksinga. From his, it's a sprawling play of tale of court intrigue and conflict set in China and based on the historical figure Zheng Chenggong, also known as Koksinga. But one of Chikamatsu's most significant contributions is in establishing the genre of the seiwamono, or domestic dramas. You'll see that at the bottom of this slide. Plays centering on commoners whose travails he elevated through his dramatic, poetic renditions of their plights. Now, to understand some of the importance of this contribution, it's important or useful to know that in the Edo period, when Bunraku flourished, it was a time of peace that followed roughly 100 years of clan wars and political upheavals that brought the Tokugawa shogunate to power. And the Tokugawa governed with a strict hand to maintain the peace, deploying a Confucian social model. In this model, power lay fully in the hands of the samurai class, with the emperor as a mere figurehead. The peasants who produced food were considered to be the next most significant social group. But the merchants, who were relegated to one of the lowest classes in society. And the main dramas in the kabuki and puppet theaters originally dealt with the lives of the samurai. This is political intrigues and larger than life figures, sometimes gods, and often they included fantastical events. The de facto situation, however, was quite different. Since this was a time of peace and Japan was also closed to outside trade, the merchant class grew in wealth as their businesses thrived. And with their wealth came their desire for greater social recognition. The urban centers of Edo, today's Tokyo, and Kyoto and Osaka, also grew into lively hubs of trade and gave rise to these new entertainments, kabuki and and the puppet theater, the Bunraku. And they addressed themselves to this restless urban audience. Prostitution also increased, and in the tea houses, which were basically brothels, closely associated with the theaters, women who had generally been sold into service for the financial benefit of their families learned to craft themselves into fantasy images of love and sexuality, catering to their male clients' desires. The tea houses and theaters were located in special sections of the city where their activities were licensed, and these were sometimes called the licensed quarters or the pleasure quarters. And there, an elaborate alternative social world emerged with its own etiquettes and standards, where merchant class men with money, who could learn how to navigate this sphere, could gain the social status they lacked under the official power structure. To have enough money to court a high-class courtesan was a sign of prestige. Less well-off merchants could go bankrupt spending money on courtesans they fell in love with. And all of these kinds of stories became fare for the Bunraku and later the Kabuki plays. When seiwa-mono or domestic dramas first appeared in the 1670s, that term seiwa meant colloquial language or gossip pieces. And these were short sketches based on actual but scandalous events in the lives of commoners, the kinds of sensational stories found in tabloid magazines. They were in the kabuki one-act afterpieces given to second-tier actors, so they were not the main fare. The early seiwa-mono, however, had already expressed a kind of dissatisfaction with the government by staging the unhappy lives of ordinary people. So Chikamatsu's plays, however, transformed the seiwa-mono through devices that brought audiences to empathize with his protagonists and established a new kind of realism on the stage. In the text Naniwa Miyage, a souvenir of Osaka, which his friend Hozumi Ikan wrote, and it records Chikamatsu's views on playwriting. And in it, he quotes Chikamatsu saying, quote, "Art is something which lies in the slender margin between the real and the unreal," unquote. And it is this blend of realistic detail with heightened reality of the puppet stage that contributed to Chikamatsu's success. While Chikamatsu shows us the intricate details of the everyday lives of commoners and their stressful social situations, he depicts them as caught in a noble struggle between giri, their duty or obligation, and ninjō, their very human emotions, a strongly realistic element. So such high-stakes dramatic conflicts were previously reserved for depictions of samurai and members of the nobility. Elevating merchants and prostitutes through these poetic depictions was an affront to the Tokugawa regime. Now, when Chikamatsu was writing, the puppets used on stage were not as elaborate as the ones we see in the Bunraku today. And there are some surviving traditions around Japan that reflect earlier styles and forms of manipulation. Two of these, each with a 350-year history, can be found in Hakusan City in Ishikawa Prefecture. They both have plays by Chikamatsu in their repertoires, and neither uses the jōruri style of music and chanting. And in fact, they use different styles of music and chanting from each other. Fukaze Deku Mawashi, the one you're seeing here, now these figures you can see are extremely simple. They're basically two interconnected sticks wrapped together. And yet the performers can still get a lot of movement and nuance out of their puppets. And let's see a little bit of video that I included here. And this is the master puppeteer of this troupe. And here he's performing a female puppet. When he does sort of the male warrior puppets, there is a more vigorous movement and you get his stomping along with it. And stomping is a very important component of Japanese arts in general. We also will see it in Bunraku. So this is still an exciting form, even though it's a precursor and an earlier form. Now this is the other troupe in that area, Higashi Futakuchi Dekumai, and they have a slightly more elaborate puppet. They have also two sticks, but one is inserted in the other, which allows the head to move and turn. They also have a trigger attached to the head, which, not unlike the Bunraku puppets, lets the head sometimes move up and down on particular puppets. They put their own right hand through the sleeve of the puppet's kimono to give the puppet a right hand and allow it to grab objects like swords. On the left, the puppets have a wooden arm that just dangles down at their side. Now, if you look at ukiyo-e from the period, they give us a glimpse of how the puppet shows were performed in these early days. With one puppeteer per puppet, you can see the puppets here up at the stage screen. The audience would have been on the other side, and we see the two puppets, a single puppeteer with a puppet each in a battle. And behind them uh, um, is the shamisen player and the chanter, Okidayu. And you can see an assistant there with it getting ready to give another puppet and other people, maybe those are puppet figures hanging in the back that are maybe going to be used, and the spectators would have been on the other side. And when these two puppet troops in Ishikawa perform today, their setup is not too different from what we see in those early ukiyo-e images. For sometime around the, so in the early 18th century, as the puppet plays grew in popularity, they competed with the ever more extravagant kabuki theater. And both theaters continually sought new ways to attract and entertain their restless audiences. In trying to emulate some of what their human counterparts could accomplish on the kabuki stage, the puppets became bigger and more elaborate. In 1727, 2 years after Chikamatsu's death, innovations were made in the puppets so that their eyes and mouths could open and close, and their hands could grasp objects. In 1730, there were innovations that allowed the eyes to roll, and in 1736, they added movement to the eyebrows. Now, the puppet that the completed puppet you see here is actually of a different character from the one you're looking at inside. So that's a sambaso character that does kind of ritual dance performances before the plays. The one that's in process here is more of a kind of warrior. I like the sambaso because you can clearly see that the eyes move and the mouth would open and close on this puppet. And what you can see in the puppet in progress here, you get a peek inside at all the little mechanisms and strings that are required to move the eyes and the mouth and make these features function that are built in. And this is just a little diagram. If you go again to the exhibit at the Japan Society, you'll see these set up. This gives you a little sense of how the heads are carved. You start with a wooden block, and then there's a sketch made on it. That's then carved out, and then the puppet's head is split in two so that it can be hollowed out, and these mechanisms can be built inside. And then this headpiece is put onto a piece that you can see at the bottom here, which is the handle that the puppeteer uses. And you can see how those strings are going to get connected so that the toggles in the back here move different parts, and the one in the front allows the head to move up and down. So you can see a little bit about the kind of process. 1733, they allowed the fingers to become jointed, which made for very dexterous hand movements. And if you have familiar with kabuki, where there are these mie poses, where the actors move their hands and their eyes and faces in these dramatic ways, you can see how the puppets are starting to emulate those, or being able to emulate those very big dramatic gestures, where the whole face is involved and the hands are maybe very stretched out. And it allows a lot of other kinds of dexterity. Bunraku also has some trick puppets that are a lot of fun. So for instance, you see one here that is a kind of comic warrior who gets into a battle. He's a little bit blustery, and his head gets sliced in two, and it opens up to reveal the eyes still rolling around. And so that's a kind of comic bit that can happen. And then on the other side, you see what's called the gabu, which is used in a lot of different plays, surprisingly, where we see this beautiful female figure who transforms with the pull of a trigger into an evil demon. And so the eyes, the mouth, and these horns that pop up are all attached to this trigger that allows this magical single transformation on the stage. But importantly, in 1734, we see the debut of what's called the sannin-zukai, or three-person manipulation technique, which is now the main iconic feature of Bunraku puppetry. The first instance of it was with the single character that was used, just a single character used in the play The White Fox of Shinoda. And the master puppeteer here operates the puppet's head and right arm, and serves as the main initiator and driver of the puppet's actions. A second puppeteer operates the puppet's left hand, and a third the feet. Puppeteers spend years mastering first the feet, then the left hand, before becoming lead puppeteers, because the lead needs to know all the other parts thoroughly in order to cue their colleagues during the show while performing themselves. The three performers must work together as a tight-knit ensemble to create the sense of a unified character. Master puppeteers who are celebrities perform with their faces visible to the audience and still bring spectators to focus, the spectators' focus to their puppets. Their co-puppeteers remain masked in black, but there is little attempt to hide their presence on stage. It is part of the beauty of Bunraku that the puppets can amaze us with very realistic, detailed actions, even while continually revealing to us the artifice at work in creating them. Now, Bunraku has beautiful, intricately carved heads, as we've seen. They're called Kashira, and they are the most precious and expensive part of the puppet. And except for some specific puppet heads for specific characters, they are usually made for particular role types, like an energetic male figure, a man of great inner strength, as you see here, the young juvenile romantic lead, the young romantic female. So we have the male lead and we have the female lead, the older matron figure, and Keisei is the courtesan, or one of those prostitute courtesans at the brothels, a very common character. So these are role type characters, elaborately carved. Their bodies, by contrast, are interchangeable and surprisingly minimalist. Basically, a simple bamboo torso structure and strings that are attached to them to the wooden arms and legs. And and I have a little video so you can see this in action. I have only the two puppeteers in this video. There would be a third puppeteer who would be behind the other two, and the puppet's left arm, as you can see in the other image here, is longer. The string that attaches it is longer and has a long pole attached to it, a long rod that would allow the third puppeteer to stand further behind to allow room for the other two puppeteers to be up front. So let's just see a little bit of this in action. And notice how the foot puppeteer is using their own feet to stomp. You can see just a little example of how that works. Here's another example of a puppet, and this one is clothed, doing a much more dramatic gesture. And the main puppeteer is doing things. You'll notice that they usually start with a gesture of the hand or a slide of the foot. And that's part of the cueing for the puppeteer to follow. So you can see how it would require years of practice to know how to cue somebody and how to follow so that the puppet looks like an integrated figure. This kind of a structure, that light structure, allows the puppets to be light and flexible and easy to move. And this is even more true and even more surprising, perhaps, of the female puppeteers that don't have any legs at all. It is the foot puppeteer who gives the illusion of a female character's legs by how they manipulate her kimono. And here you see an example where we see the puppet figure is kneeling. And in the other image, you see the puppeteer showing that they're using their hand like this to create the illusion of the nude under the kimono. So this is, you can imagine the intricacy of the art. And 10 years might be what you would need to master, because they say that the foot puppeteer spends 10 years, then they graduate to being left hand, and that's another 10 years of training, and then you can become a lead puppeteer. It may not be exactly that these days, but there is a gradual training. So although those elements make the puppets light, the elaborate kimonos and headdresses that many of the puppets wear in turn make the puppets also still very heavy to carry and use. These are the butai geta. If you maybe notice, you see when we see, sorry, I'm just going to flip back for a second. You see that the, that the main puppeteer, the foot puppeteer has to get under the puppet. And so the main puppeteer is lifted up a little bit higher in order to make that happen, make that, the foot puppeteer is still crouching, but make it possible. And so they wear these high geta that allow them to be a little higher than their partners. I'm so sorry, here. So we see these, and they are on exhibit if you go to that Bunraku exhibit at the Japan Society. So this is an image of a play and performance. This is not the National Bunraku Theater. We know this immediately because we have women chanters, and they are not chanting at the National Bunraku Theater, which is all men. This is what you might call an amateur group, but some of these amateur troupes have a 200-year tradition also, like Maeda, Imada Company, which I think this might be. But I wanted to show it to you to give you a sense of the stage and how, so we have the puppeteer, the main puppeteer who's raised wearing those big geta, those big sandals, and that part of the puppeteer is hidden behind the set. You can see how it's elevated in front. We get a kind of, a kind of frame that we see them through. And here but the puppeteers themselves are sort of visible. They've got their faces covered, but there's no denying that there's 3 puppeteers for every puppet on that stage. This is another kind of view that gives you a sense of the theater. You can see in the photo here from the side, and the sketch is showing you some partitions, and those partitions again are what's covering sort of the bottom part of the puppeteers and allowing for several layers, because you might have puppets coming and going, some in front of a house, some inside the house. So these stages can get quite elaborate. I had trouble finding a good photo that you could see for the Bunraku stage. This is one, simply because it's such a wide space these days. And we have here, you can see the wideness of the space. I'm sorry, it's a little out of focus, but on one side, you see the puppeteers in a house, the puppets in a house, but then next to it, there's a tree, and we have another puppet who's up in the tree and a set painted in the back. And then on the side, where we always find the chanter and the gidayu, the chanter, the gidayu, and the shamisen player who are narrating and performing. So to get a whole view of that stage is a little hard to squeeze on these slides. Now, the National Bunraku Theater has been traveling in the US right now. And I don't know if you got to see their performances somewhere, but I wanted to share that it's hard to get them to travel because you can see the enormous number of people involved. They told me that when they're at the Puppet Theater in Osaka, it might be 60 people in front of the stage and behind the stage, getting everything going for one of these performances. So they traveled with a smaller troupe, but still like 28 people. And some people are, just taking care of the puppets backstage, etc. And to facilitate this, for one of the plays, Love Suicides at Sonezaki, instead of bringing and building a set, they tried something new, which is also a kind of bid to try and get younger generations interested in Bunraku. And that was, instead of that, for the background, they used an animated background, scenography by Kazuo Oga, who is the art director for many classic Studio Ghibli animes, known for these beautiful landscapes that he does. And in anime like My Neighbor Totoro and Princess Mononoke, extremely popular, especially with young people. And it was quite beautiful, and it moved. These are not the images from that. I don't have images specifically. Those were specifically made for this tour. But these are some of you get a sense of the kinds of landscapes that he does. So to finish up, I want to show you a little bit of one of these plays, and I want to give you a little introduction. Hopefully, we have time for both. And this is from Love Suicides at Sonezaki. It's the final scene called Tenji no Mori. Now, this play was Chikamatsu's first domestic drama, and it helped establish the genre, which and the play itself remains an enduring favorite of the puppet theater. The play premiered on June 20th, 1703, barely a month after the real event it's based on took place, which was namely the double suicide of a poor merchant and a prostitute who had fallen in love. The characters here are in that style of Chikamatsu, caught between their giri or social obligations and their personal feelings or ninjō. And Chikamatsu transforms their suicide into this poetic double sacrifice for love. The play was such a popular hit that tragically, there was a wave of double suicides in the following year. And of course, this was a great affront to the Tokugawa government. And I tend to put in here a little disclaimer, of course, that this is a very idealized view of suicide. And if people are, suicide is a very serious issue, and people should be careful about discussing suicide in kind of romanticized ways these days. But this is a very romantic portrait. In this play, Tokubei is a young merchant, and he's in love with this courtesan, Ohatsu. And by a series of complications, he ends up in a really problematic circumstance. And some of the complications that are a little detailed to go into include him alienating his uncle, who's also his employer, because he refuses to marry the guy his uncle wants, the woman his uncle wants him to marry, because he's in love with Ohatsu. And then he also gets, part of all of this is him getting tricked into lending money to somebody who is a supposed friend, and the money is money he's supposed to return to his uncle. And the friend then claims that he never lent him money, and on top of that, he starts a rumor that Tokubei is the one trying to extort money from him. So poor Tokubei, this lowly merchant, finds himself in this complicated situation, and he's desperately in love with this woman. And they decide that the one way out of their situation, to be free of society's obligations, is to be with his love, is to commit a double suicide, so they can be united in the afterlife, reborn on the same lotus flower in the Buddhist Western paradise. Now, this scene has what's called a Michiyuki, or going on the road scene, which is a segment where that the character's journey, and their journey is conveyed through poetic language that's full of thematic allusions. The lovers sneak out of the brothel and they leave the town behind, looking for the ideal spot to commit suicide. And they find a place where both a pine and palm tree grow together out of the same tree trunk. And they feel that this, is a representative of their intertwining love. Their journey is expressed in terms of a Buddhist journey of leaving the world and worldly pain and suffering behind and moving towards death and release. They hear a bell tolling dawn, and for them it echoes the bliss of paradise. They cross a river that's going to swell with their tears, and crossing that river is already a step of this journey into the next world. The Buddhism that's reflected in this play is called Pure Land Buddhism, which was popular especially with lower classes, in which praying to Amida Buddha by repeating the invocation Namu Amida Butsu, Namu Amida Butsu many times is supposed to bring deliverance in the afterlife. So as they come closer to the moment of their deaths, they repeat these words and they tie themselves to a tree, hoping to be beautiful even in death. But even within this ideal, their suicide is rendered with uncomfortable details that bring home the reality of the dreadful act. Tokubei tries to kill this woman he loves, but his hand trembles and the blade slips. The narrator describes how he finally twists the blade to achieve his goals. And the play balances between that highly realistic elements and that realism that turns it into art that Chikamatsu talked about. So I'm going to stop this sharing and travel to a little video. I hope we have a little more time. Is this okay for you guys? Let's see, I'm going to escape this and go to my video. Now, this is sort of an old video, so in some ways I want to apologize for that, but I still think it's a wonderful example because you see the puppets, you're going to hear the chanting, and it's narrated by Fabian Bowers, who is long past, but he gives you what's happening in the, if you don't understand the Japanese, which is complicated anyway, to understand the English of what's happening and gives you a sense of it. So let's watch a little bit of this in action, and I might jump around a little bit so you see some different parts.
Each step dissolves the frost. This dream within a dream. How sad. Counting of dawns, 7 strokes, six, have sounded.
I'm going to skip ahead a little bit so you can see some of the kind of more detailed action that we get in this, because I know we have limited time.
As they will tomorrow. And she splits her obi belt, symbolic of parting from her parents. She cuts herself. Leaving this world and my beloved mother, my dearest father. And Tokubei ties the 2 parts of the obi belt together.
So I think I'm going to stop there because I know we want to leave some time for questions and any discussion. But I hope that, giving you this background on the tradition allows you to see that small scene even and start to see all of the details, first of all, of how all those different parts of the form work together, the music, how they're doing the chanting, the puppets, and the kind of detail, very realistic detail of the puppets, but also that sort of poetic aspect of what they express.
Thank you, Claudia. That was so interesting because I feel especially lucky because I got to see that particular play at the Japan Society. And I would encourage everybody to see Bunraku Backstage. It goes at Japan Society until January 19th. We do have questions. One of the questions that I actually received even before you started talking was Were there specific cities in which Bunraku developed in Japan?
Yeah, so Osaka was really the center,
Mhm.
and Dotonbori was the area that it really flourished, and that's so that was those areas that were sort of licensed for these kind of entertainments, and that was really the hub. Um, yeah, so that's exactly where it is. I mean, there were then itinerant companies so that traveled, and so for instance, if you go to Ida City today, Ida has actually become a kind of home for other kinds of puppetry. They have a big puppet festival every summer in Ida, and there are two so-called amateur troupes that are there that have a very long, each of them has a very long history doing basically the repertoire of Bunraku, the style of performance, all of those details. And so some of these were started by, troops that either people who went to study in Osaka or itinerant performers who traveled.
And you, I don't know if Bunraku is like kabuki. Were there also, could there be, I mean, are there now women puppeteers?
So in the National Bunraku, so actually the National Bunraku Theater is the theater space, and there's a company that's at the theater space that's its permanent company, and that company has still does not have women performing. Uh, but there are actually in that at the National Bunraku Theater, a lot of women backstage, women working on the hair, with women working with clothes, doing all kinds of things more than there used to be. And women are, as fewer men sort of elect to be in these traditional arts, it's opened up spaces for women. And one of the main national treasure puppeteers said actually a couple of years ago when I was in Japan at New Year's, they were interviewing him, and he said that they were considering uh, starting to accept women because they are getting so many fewer applicants. So they haven't done it yet, but they have. But I showed you that image from one of the so-called amateur troupes. So there are a lot of women who practice,
Mhm.
especially as gidayu, train as gidayu, and perform in these so-called amateur. I mean, they're amateur because they're not making their full lives and living. They're not fully supported, but they might devote a lot of time to it. And you can see you have to be skilled enough to do any part of this tradition. So there's a lot of women doing puppetry and this kind of puppetry, but they're not at the National Bunraku Theater in Osaka.
But one of the questions that we just got is, are there new puppet plays being written and performed in the 20th and 21st centuries as opposed to revised or updated versions of old classic plays?
Yeah, there are a lot of, I would say at the National Bunraku Theater, there are a lot of kind of, or not only say a lot, but there are certainly experiments going on. So for example, I saw this won't be a new play, but it was a revised, it was a version of a Moliere play that was done as a Bunraku show. I think they've tried something. I think this is true. They tried something based on anime characters, so they're looking for ways to bring people in, and it's always a now the puppets. You see the way they move. The way they move is very those particular puppets that they have that people have trained with are very much based on a kind of Edo period style of dress, a set of conventions, of physicality that you can also see in kabuki. And so there's a kind of specificity to that. So it's hard to write a whole new, if you're doing a contemporary situation, for example, you have to really change the puppets or the way you're using them, or, and you have to really change that tradition. So I think there are some experiments, uh, uh, but I don't know that there's like a whole new world of Bunraku plays.
And the person further asked, do the puppets have standard stylized performance movements, or does each puppeteer provide individualized movements?
Yeah, they have standardized performance movements, and you train, especially, and they're done by role type, right? So if you're if you're performing a warrior figure, we saw a little bit of that kind of movement in that little video I showed, where they've got those big, their legs move in big gesture, big stomps, and they take up a lot of space. And you're always kind of in the kabuki as well. You'll notice the characters kind of start going right to go left, start going left to go right. They're very dance-like gestures. It also helps to cue the puppet, the puppeteers. So the puppeteer might, turn the head in a direction that's cueing the foot puppeteer and the left hand puppeteer to know where to go. So making those puppets move as integrated characters with 3 puppeteers requires very strong conventions and practices of puppetry. And they can kind of sometimes come in and out of who's doing which one because they know them so well if you're getting cued correctly.
We had another question. Is the scenery for each play set by tradition, or can a new performance improvise and change scenery?
I think at this point they're pretty much set. There are standard ways that certain kinds of plays are performed. And yeah, I think as far as I know, that's pretty set.
Mhm. Finally, just in conclusion, because it was such an interesting talk and we learned so much, just quickly, how did you get interested in Bunraku?
Well, that's a kind of long story. I'm going to start quickly. I first have to give a mention, a shout out, whatever, to when I was in college. I took a course from a man named Leonard Pronko, who was the first non-Japanese person to train in kabuki at the National Kabuki Theater in Tokyo. And he was a professor of dramatic theater and literature. He had started in French theater, and he was teaching at my university, and he taught a course on Japanese theater and covered No and Bunraku and Kabuki. And he really introduced me to this world and made me fall in love with it. And things I still say about some of these traditions when I teach are things he said in that class when I was a freshman undergraduate. And that's always been something I've been interested in, but kind of in a more larger idea of theater. And it was in the last 20 years that I've really started focusing on puppetry in general, more specifically. And that is due to the Henson puppetry festivals that were in New York. They were doing them every 2 years, and they introduced so much interesting work that for adult audiences from around the world, contemporary as well as traditional things. And I was looking at it and I started asking a lot of questions about how am I watching puppetry differently from other forms of theater, especially with contemporary work. So that kind of plunged me more fully into getting back to puppetry specifically, and within that, going back to Bunraku and other forms of Japanese puppetry.
Well, I think that all your knowledge today made us all fall in love with it as well. So Claudia, once again, thank you so much for speaking to us today. And for everybody else, we do hope that you will look at our website. We're really trying to get more and more people to use the JapaneseArtSoc.org website to look for upcoming programs and activities. So thank you very much, and good evening.